Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing a clueless teen, until the defendant started dismantling the case like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it. Hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19, stood accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear. The real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. But Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one. He had never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Jalen had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake, though the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, fingerprints, an arrest. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me. And for most people in the room, it probably did." The case looked clear-cut. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. "Your Honor, my client—" Jalen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. because everything was about to change. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at him. On what grounds? Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But, he let the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson frowned, glancing toward Carrington. Counselor Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, he let the sentence trail off. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor? Carrington finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. Your Honor, he said, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. That's true. He took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a deep breath, his tone calm and controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything to regain control. But Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done, Jalen said, turning to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly admitted, No. Jalen's lips pressed together. So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say would change everything. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. He turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington scrambled. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle, but Jalen shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. No, Your Honor, Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Jalen for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence, and then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, You should consider law school. Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it, he was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Here's the lesson we should learn. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. And he knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think even for a second, then share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know.